Hello, and a very warm welcome to this special event for the Monetary Authority of Singapore's Golden Jubilee Conference. This joint lecture is organized in conjunction with the inaugural Next Step Global Conference, a collaboration between the Peterson Institute for International Economics and Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, as well as the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or MAS, in celebration of the authority's 50th anniversary. We are honored to have you join us today, connecting to us from all across the world. If you're in Asia, good evening. If you're joining us out of Europe and the Africas, good afternoon. And to our viewers further west in the Americas, good morning. Today's program opens with welcome remarks by Mr. Ravi Menon, Managing Director of the MAS, followed by the keynote lecture by Mr. Martin Wolf, exploring if it's possible for humanity to work together to deliver global public goods. The session will round off with a dialogue and Q&A with Mr. Wolf, moderated by Professor Danny Quah, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. You are welcome to take part in the Q&A by submitting your questions for Mr. Wolf using the Q&A function on the platform that you're joining us from. We are very much looking forward to your participation. First, I'd like to invite the Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Mr. Ravi Menon, for his welcome remarks. Mr. Menon, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are marking two events this evening. First, the inaugural Next Step Global Conference, jointly organized by the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Peterson Institute of International Economics. I hear there have been some rich discussions over the past 2 days. Second, the Monetary Authority of Singapore's Golden Jubilee Conference, which will extend to what promises to be an enriching set of discussions tomorrow. I would like to thank our partners for this very fruitful collaboration. At the intersection of these two conferences this evening, we are delighted to host this joint lecture featuring the inimitable Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. Martin is respected internationally as a journalist and commentator on global economic and financial issues. His sharp insights and cogent writing have helped many to make sense of the major economic and financial events of the past 20 years. Martin's perspectives have influenced how many of us central bankers and economic policymakers think about a range of issues close to our hearts, from globalization to inequality to the systemic effects of debt accumulation. In fact, just yesterday, I circulated to my senior colleagues in the Singapore government and the board and management of MAS, Martin's op-ed on climate change, published in the FT just last week, entitled, "What is the least we need from COP26?" And amid the deluge of articles we're all reading around COP26, I thought it was one of the clearest and most incisive expositions of what the world needs to do to stave off climate disaster. With the G20 meetings having just concluded in Rome and the world's leaders gathered in Glasgow for COP26, it is most timely that Martin will speak today on the topic, is it possible for humanity to cooperate in delivering global public goods? Both the pandemic that continues to rage and the climate that continues to change do not respect national borders. Vaccines and decarbonization are the ultimate global public goods to save mankind from the virus and the climate respectively. But alas, both are in short supply. The world needs to figure out a way to ensure an equitable supply of vaccines, as well as a substantial reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. What framework of international cooperation will be conducive to promote the delivery of these and perhaps other global public goods? How can the inherent tensions between national priorities and global interests be reconciled. There are no neat solutions to these challenges, but if there is someone who can cogently clarify the issues, it must be Martin Wolf. Let me now invite Martin Wolf to deliver the 2021 Peterson Institute Lee Kuan Yew School Monetary Authority of Singapore joint lecture. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It is an enormous honor and pleasure to address the Peterson Institute of International Economics and Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy's Next Step Global Conference, and simultaneously the Monetary Authority of Singapore's Golden Jubilee Conference. The theme I am addressing is, I think, simply the most important we confront as a species. Human ingenuity has created a world that human nature makes almost impossible to manage. Our ingenuity has delivered an integrated global economy, weapons of mass destruction, and a threatening transformation of the biosphere on which we and all other living creatures depend. Our nature is, I think, for good evolutionary reasons, characterized, all too characterized indeed, by short-sightedness, mutual suspicion, and a deep tribalism. In sum, our virtues are at war with our vices. In what follows, I will first seek to describe the three essential global public goods as I see them. I will then consider why delivering these goods is so difficult. I will then turn to how attempts at delivering a somewhat more limited range of global public goods worked and sometimes did not work during the Cold War. I will then proceed to look at why delivering global public goods is becoming even harder today, partly because the global balance of power has shifted dramatically, and partly because the goods we must provide have broadened so considerably. And finally, I will suggest a way of moving forward. My central point is that we have to cooperate. Indeed, we are doomed to do so because we are so deeply interdependent. We have made ourselves so deeply interdependent over the last few hundred years. But our ability to do so is constrained by the sheer complexity of the task and by deepening fissures among the world's states, especially nowadays between the US and its allies on the one hand and China and its allies on the other. So we need to cooperate in an increasingly divided world. How is this to be done? My brief answer is ambitiously, but also pragmatically. So what are the overarching global public goods that I'm going to discuss? What do the people of the world need most? The answers seem to me pretty obvious. Prosperity for themselves, their families, their friends, their countries. Peace and protection against environmental disasters and global pandemics. These public goods are, of course, interconnected, closely interconnected. One cannot have prosperity without global peace. Neither peace nor prosperity is likely to be sustained in a world ruined by environmental catastrophes or threatened, as it might well be, by far worse pandemics than COVID-19. Moreover, it is quite clear these are all public goods. Our prosperity depends in significant measure on the prosperity of others. Similarly, it will be impossible to thrive in a world of conflict among great powers. That the global environment and global health are public goods surely goes without saying. So why is it so hard to deliver global public goods? Providing public goods like these, so in domestic terms, civil peace, prosperity, environmental protection, and successful control of pandemics and other diseases, is of course hard enough at the national level. But it is inevitably far harder at the global one, where there exists no sovereign power able to internalize all the externalities and force the necessary changes in behavior. At the national level, there exists a legitimate sovereign power, or at least a sovereign power, with the right and some capacity at least, though variable, to legislate the provision of public goods. But global provision of public goods depends on agreement among close to 200 sovereigns, and especially among the more powerful ones in the group of 20 and the superpowers above all. Without effective agreement, free riding inevitably undermines provision of global public goods. Again, at the national level, there exists a political process able to settle, at least in a tolerable manner, questions of legitimate burden sharing in the provision of these public goods. At the global level, agreement on these questions must be reached among countries with vastly different degrees of prosperity, vastly different degrees of responsibility for the problem, and vastly different degrees of ability to contribute to a resolution. Finally, even at the national level, it is hard to respond to uncertain costs that will emerge over many decades. And again, doing so is far harder at the global level because the perspectives of countries on the challenges in the distant future tend to differ so much. So that leads me to the next questions. To what extent did provision of global public goods work in the past? The unsurprising reality is that we have never had anything close to a global system for the provision of relevant public goods. Focusing just on the period after the Second World War, I don't have the time to go back earlier, prosperity was underpinned to a significant, though not perfect degree, by a complex patchwork system of multilateral rules, compromises, and expedients designed and largely run in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War by the then dominant Western powers, above all the US. A multilateral rules-governed system, a phrase often used, has in truth never existed. And countries were, of course, never treated as sovereign equals within the system either. On the contrary, the system has, as I've said, always been a patchwork, and there have always been radical differences in power and influence within the system. After the end of the Cold War, in the beginning of the 1990s, and especially in 1995, when what had been provisionally applied, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, was transformed into the World Trade Organization. One might have imagined such a multilateral system was coming, at least in trade, and many thought this. But even that claim would obviously seem absurd today. Progress has turned into regress, with backsliding by major powers, 20 years of failure to complete the Doha round of trade negotiations, the recent US war on the dispute settlement system within the WTO, and of course, most important of all, the trade war between the US and China. Moreover, the main principle underlying the system was more that of a mercantilist balance of terror than economic reasoning or deep attachment to the rule of law. Donald Trump's bilateralism may have been ludicrous, but it was not, in truth, far removed from the idea of reciprocity that has always underpinned the system. A relatively developed system for protection of trade-related intellectual property does exist, though its role is in truth mainly to protect monopolists. Global management of finance, especially outside banking, as well as of capital flows, exchange rates, currency reserves, and so forth, has always been very limited. The Bretton Woods exchange rate system collapsed in 1971. While liberalization of current accounts is now advanced, global attempts to agree on liberalization of capital flows failed in the 1990s. There exists, of course, essentially no global system for managing migration, possibly the most important flow of all. Crucially, in the post-war period, the Soviet Union participated neither in the global economy to any significant extent, nor in the global economic institutions. This left the US and its allies as the dominant economic players. So they played the principal role in creating the rules. They also controlled the most important institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the GATT, later the WTO. Developing countries were largely allowed to do what they wanted in managing their trades policies, but in times of crisis, they were, of course, subject to conditional lending, above all from the IMF. If we turn to peace, we find that it was underpinned simply by a balance of terror in the form of the nuclear standoff. The relationship in the Soviets and the West was one of ideological conflict and military stalemate. This proved consistent with a great deal of destructive conflict, proxy wars of various kinds in the rest of the world, and above all in developing countries, as well as extremely perilous moments between the superpowers, above all the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which very nearly ended up in nuclear war. Global management of a wide range of security issues has remained virtually non-existent, including some that have very significant economic implications, such as cybersecurity and the management of space. We continue instead to rely on the old-fashioned notion of the balance of power, updated to the more modern balance of nuclear terror, with all the room for catastrophic miscalculation this inevitably creates. Finally, action on the global environment and global pandemics has been depressingly limited. There has been one remarkable success, the agreement on the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer of 1987. The world has been engaging in discussions of the threat of climate change for 3 decades. Kyoto, after all, occurred in 1992. Yet not only has the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but even the annual flow into the atmosphere continued to rise. On pandemics, the striking feature has been technological success, notably with the vaccines, as Mr. Menon has remarked, but political failure with relatively little cooperation, shown most notably in the failure of the global vaccine effort. Ultimately, then, the order, if one can describe it as such, that existed in the era of the Cold War, which was a patchwork, which rested on domestic political legitimacy and a degree of willing cooperation, alongside a balance of terror with the rival superpower, and basically a willingness to ignore the huge environmental challenges that were emerging. Why is this patchwork still harder to operate today than it was at that earlier period? The most important reason why this has become even more difficult, in my view, is the most evident. Profound changes in economic power and influence, with the relative decline of the US and its allies, and the relative rise of emerging and developing countries, above all China. A second reason why the non-system system is becoming harder to operate, even than it used to be, is that China is, of course, very dissimilar to the old incumbent powers. Its history is different. While not trying to spread a revolutionary ideology worldwide, as the Soviet Union did, China has an autocratic political system rooted in a blend of its own history and civilization with Marxist ideology. It played no role in the creation of the post-Second World War economic and political order. Its incomes per head remain significantly lower than those of the Western powers, and yet its economy is relatively vastly bigger than was that of the old Soviet Union, and it views Western power as being, in many respects, deeply illegitimate. A third reason why the non-system system has become harder to operate is that, unlike the old Soviet Union, China has a dynamic and innovative market economy with a strong private sector and a deep integration into the world economy, especially in trade. Indeed, it is already a more important trading partner than the US for a huge range of countries across the globe. A fourth reason for the emerging difficulties is that developments in the Western powers, and especially the US, notably deindustrialization and rising inequality, have undermined the legitimacy of the democratic political system itself, but also of the open world economy and the very notion of a law-governed order. Donald Trump's election was proof of all that, and was then duly followed by an assault on almost every element in the international order, from the trading system to the Paris Climate Agreement. A fifth and perhaps most important reason is that we are trying to grapple with far more difficult global environmental challenges than during the Cold War. These require us to agree on a rapid and politically vexed restructuring of the entire global energy system, which is, of course, the foundation of our modern economies, while still permitting rapid economic growth, especially in emerging and developing countries. It is revealing of the difficulties in any attempt to do so that Xi Jinping has decided not to attend COP26 in Glasgow. So how might the needed global public goods be delivered? How might an international order of some kind function in a world characterized by a long-lasting superpower rivalry, one that seems to me likely to last for a generation or generations, characterized too by a far greater need for cooperation to protect the planet, and also characterized by deeper divisions right inside our highly integrated global market economy than ever before. If it was hard during the Cold War, it's obviously becoming harder still now. The answer I would suggest is to abandon any notion of a comprehensive order. That was already impossible 4 decades ago. It is far more impossible now. Instead, we need to define a minimum list of fundamental core interests that unite us all. The aim should similarly be to define a minimum list of global and regional agreements that will make it possible for us to achieve these common objectives. On prosperity, the most important requirement, I believe, is for every country, but especially the superpowers, to define the freedoms they desire and insist upon to protect what they view as their core economic, political, and security autonomy. At the same time, in all other areas, giving participants the ability to foresee what their policies will be, because those policies are agreed and have their commitment behind them. On peace, the core objective must be transparency about each side's objectives and capacities, with a view to avoiding all military or similar surprises. This will require ongoing, deep engagement between Chinese and Western militaries and civil establishments associated with security issues daily across the board. And this will have to include quite a number of issues which have not historically been part of security discussions, notably cybersecurity. On protection of the planet, the most important challenge of all, it is essential to agree on how to mitigate threats to climate and protect the life on the planet, because it is so obviously in the interests of everybody. COP26 will be a powerful indicator of whether this is at all possible. But I would add that greater capacity to manage pandemics is also essential. So this is how I would conclude. We are at a hinge moment in history. The old Western-dominated system into which emerging and developing countries were invited, at least in its economic respects, is not going to develop into a more ordered global system as many hoped in the 1990s. Meanwhile, the old challenge of securing peace in a nuclear age remains, and the new challenge of protecting the biosphere from damage is becoming ever more pressing. So what is to be done? We must not abandon all norms and rules of behavior in the international sphere. That will be a catastrophe threatening peace, prosperity, and the planet itself. We must focus on defining and making workable the minimum cooperation we must have if humanity is to achieve what everybody needs and wants as an essential minimum. It will involve sitting down with one another to establish or renew first institutions and practices for promoting prosperity that will offer at the minimum development cooperation, management of debt, and liberal and predictable trade. Second, institutions and practices for protecting the peace that will deliver transparency and credible security to all. And finally, institutions and practices for protecting the planet that will deliver a habitable earth for us and our fellow creatures. None of this will be easy, and it may even prove impossible. Yet we have got to a point at which the alternative to rising somewhat above ourselves is evident catastrophe. If we are to enjoy peace, prosper, and protect our planet, we must learn to cooperate in core areas while agreeing to differ in others. And let us all hope and pray that we can do so. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf, for that thought-provoking and, if I may add, sobering lecture. We'll now move on to the moderated dialogue and Q&A segment of this session, and would like to invite you to pose your questions via the Q&A function on the platform that you're joining us from. Our moderator for this segment is Professor Danny Quah, Dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor Quah's research interests lie in income inequality, economic growth, and international economic relations. His work takes an economic approach to world order, focusing on global power shifts and the rise of the East, as well as alternative models of global power relations. Professor Quah has also done extensive work on income inequality and social mobility and their impact on society cohesion. I now hand the time over to Professor Quah and Mr. Wolf.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Martin, for that characteristically powerful, persuasive speech. You have laid out for us compellingly and clearly the imperative for our having to rise above ourselves, our vices that you referred to at the beginning of your speech. If we don't, well, global catastrophe. You have unpacked for us both the driving forces as well as, admittedly, some of the sleepwalking that humanity has done that has brought us all to this critical, in your words, hinge point. But you give us a ray of hope. You suggest that a comprehensive, complete, orderly world order, as many others had thought should come about, is actually impossible now, just as it already was 40 years ago. But you have also described how we can carefully, gingerly piece together a kernel or a core minimum set of agreements around which a number of, in your words, fundamental common objectives might reside. I want to turn to the audience for some of the questions that have come in. One in particular, I want to describe and then rephrase, Martin, if I may, to allow a greater expansion of your ideas. The question that was asked was, yes, but what if one community's peace and prosperity come at the cost of yet others? Now, I want to rephrase that question into a somewhat more general idea, an idea that I'm sure you have encountered in discussions with people around your proposals. That idea, economists refer to as a zero-sum game, or what other writers have thought about as a zero-sum world. And as I was listening to your speech, Martin, I thought that one of the most powerful of counter narratives against your vision is indeed this notion of a zero-sum world. Now, in the zero-sum world, we know the only fundamental truth is someone gains only when someone else loses. So in that world, there are no acknowledged public goods. The set of common objectives is an empty set. And so for those adherents to the opposing view, your speech describes evidence that they don't recognize. In my view, you have provided profound evidence that of course there are global public goods. And of course, humanity shares common objectives. But for these opponents, your view is just plain wrong. So I want you to respond to how you would describe the falsity, the fallacy in the zero-sum view of the world. Over to you, Martin.
Okay. Well, there are some zero-sum elements, and it's a good way of rephrasing some of what I'm saying. I suppose of the leaders of the 20th century, the most absolutely and irreconcilably committed to a zero-sum view, and I'm not making this comment lightly but rather with all seriousness, was Adolf Hitler. He believed very passionately that the world consisted of a zero-sum conflict for power and resources, and what you didn't have, others had, and they could use it against you. And it was very much with this in mind that he, a view which very much went back to social Darwinism of the 19th century, though it of course had older roots than that. But it was with this in mind that he launched the Second World War. And I think in one very important respect, namely power, he is pretty close to correct. They say power is the ability to make other people do what you want. And if you have more of it, pretty well, it's a relative quantity, as it were. Others have less of it. And this is why conflicts for power within states and between them have always had, throughout history, a strong zero-sum characteristic. And it is also why, since there is no superior sovereign, as Thucydides argued 2,500 years ago, they tend to end in war. So I accept the zero-sumness of power, but the zero-sumness of power, the endless conflict for relative power over others, gets in the way of achieving things which are unambiguously positive sum. So in its good days, in the post-war order proposed then by the US and Western powers, there was the idea that provided you provided certain public goods we provide in terms of openness and so forth, you could create an economy in which everybody got better off because the economy was positive sum. And the economy proved dramatically to be positive sum over the last 70 years, despite difficulties and crises. The global economy and the standard of living of pretty well everyone in it has enormously expanded, almost eliminating, at least prior to the pandemic, mass destitution. That was positive sum in a very, very big way. Second, by agreeing to behavior, some of it positive and some of it built on fear, which eliminated or reduced and managed the risk of all-out war between superpowers, a level of peace was achieved. It wasn't perfect, but that peace, which meant the containment of power, essentially, the acceptance of power relations, at least to a certain degree, that allowed this a relatively peaceful world with growing trade, growing economic activity, rising standards of living across much of the world, including so dramatically in the emerging world in the last 30 or 40 years, the rise of China, the rise of India. So again, containing the logical consequences of a zero-sum view, which is war, with an agreement to accept at least orderly relations among superpowers was very beneficial. And finally, though we've only got this one huge example of the Montreal Protocol, but it's pretty clear that if we manage to contain the climate disaster, if we manage pandemics, everybody benefits. The world is a better place. We can travel more freely if everybody can. If pandemics aren't rife, we will be able to live in a much more manageable, tolerable world from the climate point of view if we cooperate. So while there is an element of negative zero-sumness, the zero-sumness usually ends up, if people really believe it, in the most negative sum activity of all, which is outright war. That's why I use the Hitler example. And there exists at the same time a very wide range of demonstrated and demonstrable positive sum gains, which can emerge if we avoid war and cooperate in the ways that I've suggested. So it seems to me the dominant characteristic of our world remains one in which there are huge positive sub-opportunities if we can contain our tendency towards viewing the world as zero-sum and so sinking, as we have so often done, into the profoundly negative sum game of war and other forms of conflict.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I may follow up on some of what you said, and perhaps press you a little bit to expand more of your ideas that you are building here. Two words that came to my mind as you were describing the ways in which historically humanity has been able to leverage the positive sum aspects of human existence. And those two words are, one, institutions, and two, leadership. And I wonder if you'd like to perhaps expand a bit on how you see the world of the last 40 years that has tried to build robust multilateral institutions that early on had seen enlightened leadership. Woodrow Wilson before this talking about a community of nations, Harry Truman talking about the United States bringing inclusively all other nations into the system, even Richard Nixon talking about how one could not leave 1 billion of humanity's arguably most creative people languishing in angry isolation. There were institutions and there were powerful leaders that saw the positive sum features that you're describing now. Do you think that humanity has also failed in the institutions that we've tried to build and the potential lack of strong benevolent leadership that we see in the world today?
Well, the short answer to that is yes, and that would have taken a much longer lecture to discuss. But let me just summarize embarrassingly simply what seemed to me to be the role of what I would say is awareness of history, awareness of opportunity, leadership, and institutional embodiment. So for many Western leaders in the middle of the 20th century, and particularly, of course, American leaders, they came to two, I think, very big, by no means universal, but the dominant ones, came to two very big conclusions. First, they had experienced in the First and Second World Wars and in the failed interwar period, so this is a 30-year period, a staggering breakdown of order, economic and political, and ultimately security, of course, two horrifying world wars, the collapse of a number of states into totalitarianism, and in their perception, diabolical consequences of the decision of the United States to withdraw from the world after the First World War. So this history was very much in their minds when they decided, both pragmatically and idealistically, to create the post-war system. And that, of course, I didn't have time to go into. It included the United Nations Security Council, but also the IMF, the World Bank, then the General Agreement on Tariff Trade, which was part of the International Trade Organization, which was never ratified. And then, of course, the Marshall Plan, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OECD, and on so forth. And in the Cold War, with the Soviet Union, Soviet system outside it, this worked far better than they expected. The simple truth is it worked far better than they expected, and it started a worldwide boom. Many emerging and developing countries were outside this, partly because of the very complex process of decolonization, partly because of the lessons they drew from the 30s, all understandable, but a mistake. And of course, partly for ideological reasons, as with Mao. Then I perceive that as the Cold War was coming to an end, a number of leaders, so that was leadership. That was leadership, the best leadership internationally I think we've probably ever had. Then came another crucial set of leaders, of whom I tend to think Deng Xiaoping was the most important, but there are others, who decided that actually this was a world they would like to be part of because it offered them prosperity. It offered them a better life, and a better life for their people and for their country and countries. And a whole host of countries with varying success, obviously China most dramatically, but also India and quite a large range of other countries decided to join this world. And the Soviet Union's collapse made this even clearer. So they then moved to this broad opening of the world system, which I tend to think was sort of symbolized by the agreement on the WTO in the mid-90s. And I was very optimistic about the possibilities of that. So that was a capstone institutionalization of the system. And for the first time, it had become relatively global. And this was all, on the whole, enormously successful. Now move on another 20 years, for the reasons I've outlined, the system is being shaken to its core in all possible dimensions. And we have, in addition, this giant environmental challenge. And at the moment, I think the crucial thing is to avoid collapse into breakdown, collapse into a different form of breakdown that occurred in the earlier 20th century within Europe, at this time on a global scale, with colossally disastrous consequences. And we really must not, because we cannot survive going through at the world level what Europe went through between 1914 and 1945, because it will be the end of us. So somehow we must sustain enough order to get through the next 100 years, they say 50, with very difficult underpinnings, when the US is profoundly, and I fear unalterably changed, and Europe is weak, China is suspicious and doubtful, and many countries find it very difficult to trust one another. It is in this spirit that I put forward this, I suppose, rather pessimistic view of the minimum we can do. Even that, and I agree completely, will require leadership, and it will require institutional embodiment in agreements like COP26 if it's successful. We cannot do without leadership in institutions. We just have to be relatively realistic about the minimum we need to do to avoid, on a global scale, the catastrophe of the first half of the 20th century within Europe. And that is what I fear. And then this leads me to my conclusion, which is a quotation from a dear friend of mine who died 35 years ago. Jan Tumlier used to be chief economist at the GATT. And he said to me, it's not true that people don't learn from history. They do learn from history, and then they forget. Well, I suppose what I'm trying to do is prevent them from forgetting completely.
Thank you very much, Martin. A wonderful, wonderful narrative on how we can take these things forwards. I want to shift our discussion a little bit in following the flow of the questions that have come in. We've talked about institutions and leadership, and we might come back to that because there are a lot of questions on that. But there's also a strand of questions from some such as Anne-Marie Schleich, who writes in the following: we see growing public discontent and impatience on the insufficient actions and progress that national governments have been able to make, far less multilateral institutions or international leaders. Do you think that it is time for us to shift the way we think about global governance away from these large traditional actors to things such as NGOs and climate activists? How do they fit in your vision of a core kernel of fundamental common interest?
This is, I think, an absolutely fascinating question on which I regard myself as in a state of mental flux. So I think at the moment that the energy of activists, campaigners, intellectuals, promoters and developers of ideas in these areas that I've been discussing, very different ones, very few people span them all, only a crazy journalist would try to span them all, are absolutely essential, absolutely necessary conditions for progress, and they always have been. So one of the reasons I'm a passionate believer and remain in the fundamental democratic idea, and will always do so, die being so, is that I believe in the essential role of the individual acting together with other individuals freely to influence public opinion and policy. So in that fundamental respect, I remain and will always remain a Western liberal. What I would think of as the better aspect of Western civilization. But while it's a necessary condition for success, it's not sufficient, because success has to work through institutionalized practices which affect large organizations on a daily basis. That is to say, through law, domestic and international, and through other routes of power, through the behavior of businesses and all the rest of it. And all that can be influenced by activists, but it cannot be determined by them. In any political system, they are an element within it, but they're not the majority, in my view, in any society. Indeed, if they were, then they would be in power and they will be the government, but they're not. They're a very important voice in this, an essential voice, and they have achieved miracles, I think, in shifting public opinion. But in the end, the final solution, the solutions to these problems have to involve organizations. Humanity cannot organize itself, I feel very strongly about this, within systems of anarchy. They have to have organized systems which allow them to predict how people behave. That's what the core elements of our civilization offer. The great problem is we don't have this at the international level. The international level is an anarchy, but we can make it less anarchistic if we make agreements which are themselves binding in domestic law. That's what made the GATT work when it worked well. That's what makes all good international agreements work, that they become part of domestic law. So within the very complex political game that is decision-making in the areas I've touched upon, which are so big and important, the activists are very significant players, but they're not decisive and cannot be on their own.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to build a bit more on your statement about Western liberalism and the very powerful vision of checks and balances that the governed, the people, hold their leaders to. In the US Constitution, there is a phrasing that the government governs through the consent of the governed. And it's a wonderful image that we want to take forward. And you've described the challenge of trying to deal with that in a world of anarchy, where sovereign nations go off and do what they will. So a question that's come in that's related to this thinking is a question from Ting Xuan Ng. It's a question about enforcement. It's a question about how, after you've built this kernel, this core minimalist set of shared common values, what do you envision for principles of enforcement? Now, in the traditional vision, in the old vision, the old world, there was a hegemon. Hegemon had power in all dimensions. And we might object to how that hegemon thinks about regulating financial markets by use of its aircraft carriers, say. But it was a hegemon that allowed enforcement. In this new world, in this new world order, or this new community of shared interests that you're describing, how do you see enforcement working?
Okay, there are different elements of this. My own guess is that we are going to see the emergence, and I say this with some distress, of spheres of influence. We are going to break the world up into spheres of influence. So some of the enforcement will occur from the dominant player within a sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence might be across all aspects of this, or just one or two. And the most obvious powers within this sphere of influence world will be the US, the EU in economic aspects, and China. It will be very messy, particularly messy at the borders, but they will have enough muscle in terms of economic influence, resources, and other instruments of power to influence and to some extent control what countries within their sphere of influence, i.e. countries that are really dependent upon them in an unbalanced way, can do. I think this is a very unfortunate direction to go, but I can't see at the moment how it's going to be avoided. I would hope, however, that was contained in the ways I've suggested by agreements among the great powers. We are moving into a great power world, of competing great power world. In these core respects, to manage trade in the way and economic relations in the way I've suggested, to manage, to avoid the sort of dangerous surprise we experienced in '62 of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I remember very well, and to manage the environment. And the enforcement, basically, in all these respects, comes down to mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction, that is to say, there exists an agreement, assuming that is reached, in which each side recognizes that if both sides abide by the agreement, both will be better off. It's a positive sum prisoner's dilemma, as it were, but it will be done in the open, so people will know if you break it. It'll be very visible if you break it, and there will be then some form of retaliation. It would depend. In some cases, the retaliation is inherent in the process, but in other cases, the retaliation will come from, for example, if you break the climate agreement, others will break their climate agreement, and everybody has a worse environment, and nobody's going to win from that. So I think of this at the moment as a mixed enforcement system, part of which will come top down within spheres of influence, and a lot of it will have to come from clear agreements on the core that I've suggested between superpowers, in ways that make clear that if they don't abide by it, they move into very, very dangerous territory. Now, to give you an example of things that did work in the past, you talked about that, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a really big attempt to improve transparency, information sharing, and then arms control, which I haven't had time to go into the whole détente process between the United States and the Soviet Union. And over a period of 20 years, it massively enhanced the security of both sides. And it didn't eliminate, but it substantially reduced the chances of a repeat of the Soviet missile crisis, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the sort of thing we're going to have to do between China and the US. I think that's at a very early stage now, but it's incredibly important that that be achieved. I think similarly, we're going to have to achieve something like this in the case of climate. Progress has been made, I would stress. I mean, I didn't have time to discuss this, but by now, close to 80% of the world's carbon emissions are covered by net zero commitments, even if they're for 2060 and 2070, which is rather late. So we are making progress. And I think part of the progress is that these agreements are becoming increasingly public. They're becoming transparent. They're things that governments are committing themselves to publicly, partly because of activist pressure, and partly because of the need to influence other governments. And the big advantage of intergovernmental relations is they are transparent. People basically know what's agreed, and basically they know if you break the agreement, and there are consequences for that. That's mutually assured destruction. So the combination of these things, I hope, will be sufficient. But we're at a very early stage of this new set of superpower relations, and they have to form a relationship which works on the basis, as I said, of agreeing to agree and agreeing to differ in other areas.
Thank you, Martin. We're going to have to end on that note of cautious optimism. but we have covered so many fascinating ideas in this dialogue with Martin. We could go on. There's so many other areas to explore emerging from his fascinating speech. I'm going to have to bring this, however, to a close given the time. This dialogue session with Martin Wolf has served at least three purposes. First and foremost, it has allowed all of us, audience, interlocutors, to be in conversation with Martin, surely one of the greatest and most insightful writers of our time on the modern global economy. Second, as Ravi Menon, the managing director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has said, this is the welcome event that has now launched the Monetary Authority of Singapore's Golden Jubilee Conference. That conference and celebration will continue in a full day of events tomorrow, Wednesday, the 3rd of November, as counted in this time zone anyway, so beginning at 8 a.m. Singapore time. Third and last, as this dialogue session comes to the end, it also brings to a close the inaugural Peterson Institute Lee Kuan Yew School Next Step Global Conference that took place yesterday and today. No matter what time zone you're in, it was yesterday and today. And that conference's earlier panels had first, supply chains in a world of conflict and COVID. Second, policy making in a big data, big tech global economy. And now this dialogue session with Martin. These sessions have reaffirmed for us the value of the vision that the Peterson Institute and the Lee Kuan Yew School brought together for the Next Step Global Conference. That vision is first that the world is at a critical inflection point where the global economy's landscape is more tentative, more conditional, and more contingent than it has been for decades, and where our future well-being depends on our now taking wiser steps going forwards. Second, hard-headed, rigorous thinking informed by empirical evidence and historical analysis is essential for how we carve out pathways ahead. Third, global inclusiveness in the conversation is key. 80% of the world's population live outside the great powers, both for reasons of legitimacy and for raising the likelihood that the outcomes we arrive at in these conversations will work out, require that these conversations engage around the planet with as many concerned, thoughtful, and informed voices as possible. I thank my friend Martin Wolf, logged in from London, for a wonderfully engaging, insightful, and thought-provoking session. And I thank our worldwide audience for all your enthusiasm, attention, and participation. Many more questions I was unable to get to. I hope on some other occasion, when we have a similar conversation, we will get to all of them. With that, I wish you all a good evening if you're here in this time zone, and a good day elsewhere. I hope to see you all again soon. Stay safe and keep healthy. Thank you all very much.
And we thank you, Professor Quah, for your excellent summary and moderation. Well, we've come now to the end of today's program. On behalf of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, I thank you for joining us in this welcome event to mark the 50th anniversary of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. We wish everyone a pleasant Tuesday. Goodbye.